Welcome to the New York Business Leaders Podcast, presented by the Coyle Group. We interview the most interesting and influential business leaders in New York and hear their stories of success, challenges, and lessons learned while building their businesses and personal brands. New episodes drop weekly, so please be sure to subscribe to get updates in your favorite stream. Without further delay, here's your host of the New York Business Leaders Podcast, Gordon Coyle.
Welcome back to the New York Business Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Gordon Coyle. Today's episode, I welcome Jerry Quinn from Driving Improved Results to the show. Jerry is an executive coach who I've known for several years. We talk about her coaching practice, who she coaches, who should consider a coach, and much more. My big takeaway in this discussion was that you can create a company culture by design or by default. It's your choice as a leader. And if you're not spending most of your time as a leader on culture and strategy, you're really missing the boat. The bottom line is that as entrepreneurs, we can easily lose sight of what's most important for our companies, for ourselves, and for our families. A coach like Jerry helps you refocus your energy and attention on what really matters most, not necessarily what the squeakiest wheel at the moment in your life is. Really great conversation that I think you'll enjoy listening or watching to. Finally, if you'd like to get in touch with Jerry, you can catch her on LinkedIn, or her website is drivingimprovedresults.com, and her email is Jerry with a J at drivingimprovedresults.com. I'll have her contact info in the show notes as well as mine if you'd like to reach out and talk about getting on the show with me. I'm always looking for interesting business leaders to speak with. Thanks for listening and supporting the podcast. Now on to the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to the New York Business Leaders Podcast. Today I've got an old friend of mine, Jerry Quinn, on the phone, who I don't remember the first time we met, but it's got to be more than 10 years ago. Jerry's an active networker in New York City, so we would bump into each other at events, at oh golly, what's the name of the club that we used to
Terrace Club.
The Terrace Club, that's right. I'd see a Terrace Club every week and had conversations, and Jerry reached out to me to be on the podcast, so I'm really happy she did, and I'm welcoming her here today. So welcome, Jerry. Good to have you.
Well, thank you. And we have a lot of shared background too, because we actually went to undergrad at the same school.
That's right.
And so we know some of those same people and some of those same dark closets where secrets are stored.
That's right. That's right. So Jerry, why don't you take a couple of minutes, introduce yourself, tell us what you do, and then we can kick off the conversation from there.
Sure. Thank you. I'm an executive coach, a business coach. I have a company called Driving Improved Results. In fact, we focus on professional training and development, and I have several other people in the company with me who focus on some things other than executive coaching, because they focus on Lean Six Sigma and project management and presentation skills and brain hacks for better productivity. But today, I think I'm going to focus on my role in that company, other than leading the company, because as an executive coach, that's where I find the most joy. That's where my purpose for empowering others is really coming out and showing itself. And I looked over my career and I said, well, what's the theme of my career? This is when we were all talking about what's your purpose in life, right? And I looked at my role as an elementary school teacher, as a therapist, as a owner of 6 businesses, as a mother, and now as a grandmother. My role has always been about empowerment, empowering other people to expand beyond what they even think their potential could be. Because people often have limited views of what they can aspire to. And they can aspire to so much more than they even imagined earlier in their lives. And of course, as an executive coach, I want to serve those people who really are executives of businesses or of their own lives. I mean, you are the CEO of your own life, right? You do get to make choices. And um, how you, whether you're an emerging leader who wants to grow or you're a leader who already of a business that's in place. I mean, I've coached people who were the leaders of a two-man team in a 200-person company. And I coached them for several years to the point where they got to be one of 4 division heads because they wanted to learn. Were on this quest for self-improvement that took them into learning about customer loyalty and management and sales and how to generate better referrals and how to lead to create a bigger vision for the whole company. And then I've worked with people who are in nonprofits and they're executive directors, but they got a lot of things going on. So let's start with a case study. Shall we start with a case study, Gordon?
Sure. Before you do that, I just want to hit on 3 words that you've used in the description or the introduction I think are really important. The first one is joy, and we don't talk a lot about joy in the business world. And I think that when we don't talk about it, we miss a big driver of people's successes. And I know you're going to hit on that. The second was purpose, and the third is empowerment. And I think together, those 3 things, we could spend hours and hours, if not days, on. So yeah, let's jump into the case study of what you want to talk about to begin with.
Yeah. And so I want to hit on what you said about joy. And there's joy and there's happiness. And then there's joy and there's a sense of meaningfulness, right? So when I think of joy, I don't think of happiness that comes and goes depending on the mood that you woke up with or whether or not there's some chemical floating around in your brain that's giving you some dopamine that's giving you a temporary high, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I think of joy, I mean a deep sense of understanding the meaning in your life and feeling fulfilled. And so that really comes with having that sense of purpose. And so purpose is really a conducive factor in joy. And then the sense of empowerment, meaning you're constantly being empowered to discover new things. And so the 3 of them are really wrapped together. And I'm glad you pulled those 3 words out because I really want to show how they're really intertwined.
Great. That's fantastic.
Case study.
Good.
An executive who is the leader of a nonprofit. He and I decided to work together, and he was kind of skeptical at first, like, well, you were recommended, but what is this really going to get for me? I'll put up with it for a couple of sessions, and then we'll see what happens, right? So now we're going on 3 years, and he's finding a lot of things and meaningfulness, joy, purpose, empowerment in his life. In fact, whenever he's having an anxious day, his spouse and some of his coworkers say, maybe you should go to talk to Jerry for a while. Because I think I've had a little bit of impact on his life. And I'm very proud of that. That's what makes it in my business is it makes it in my life when I hear the ahas that somebody says, I got that, that's what gives me goosebumps all over. So he's a director of a nonprofit, and he was telling his 8 direct reports to the 8 people who work under him as department heads. Well, when you go on vacation, I'll be your backup. Yeah, right. So that meant he never had a life because always somebody was going on vacation who was doing 2 jobs, right? And what I coached him about was delegation and how each of his direct reports should have their own assistant to be their backup. So that number 1, he didn't have to take on their monkey and their job when they left for the vacation. Secondly, he was empowering them to empower others. Thirdly, when they had their own assistant who was gradually learning their job, he was building a succession plan into his own organization. If that team leader should ever leave, there would be an assistant who would at least be mostly trained to fill in either permanently or at least for an interim. So, those are the kinds of things that have to do with delegation. And I tell people who are leaders in organizations, you really have 2 jobs. One is culture the other is strategy. And if you're taking on other people's work, then you're limiting what you can do in the areas of culture and strategy. Don't take on other people's work. Delegate to them. Make sure they're well trained. Make sure you've given it to them to do after that training is in place and they're competent there. But don't take on their work. Delegate to them, and that lets you focus on culture. Now, another thing this coachee learned is that in the realm of culture, you can have a default culture or you can have a designed culture. And a design culture is something you actually focus on. You focus on it by making sure you empower others, making sure that there's kindness, making sure that your values are adhered to, and calling out people who don't adhere to the values. If you have kindness or customer service or empowering staff as part of your value system, or even, Zappos puts in a little bit of fun into their value system. Others put in continuous learning into their value system. That becomes part of the culture. And you want to act on that every day. And you want to ask people, how are you living our values today? You want to demonstrate that by how you're acting. I mean, you're the biggest role model there is for the whole company.
Mhm.
So you've got to live these things. You've got to be the change you want to see in the world, to quote an expression.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Just interrupt for a second. So the types of customers that you're working with, privately held businesses, size-wise, what are we talking about?
I usually tell people I focus on those clients that are 5 to 150 million. That's the upper end of the small business market and the low end of the middle market.
Mhm.
On the other hand, here I am working with a nonprofit, and I also have contracts with New York City, which is an enterprise, right?
Mhm.
So sometimes you have a target, and then there are things that fall outside that target.
Right.
And
The next thing I wanted to ask about, because as a small business owner and knowing a lot of small business owners, why do you think it's so hard for owners of businesses and even CEOs of larger businesses, middle-sized businesses, to delegate?
control. They're always about getting that control, right? They don't think anybody can do it as well as they can. And they're afraid to let go. So there's a fear there that the other person is incapable. Now, where does that fear come from? It comes from their own self. They're projecting that if I haven't been trained and then I'm not capable of doing it, so they must not be capable of doing it. And they're fearing that they don't trust their own training process or their own hiring process. So somebody who has to maintain tight control is really functioning from a sense of fear rather than a sense of abundance, right?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a great explanation, and I have a very good friend who I'm going to make sure I send him at least this portion of this clip of the conversation, because for years, and I mean for 15 years that I've known him, maybe more, his biggest hangup has not been able to delegate, and he has not been able to grow his firm as rapidly as he'd like. And I think predominantly due to the fear of giving up things over to other people to manage and handle, because of that exact fear that you mentioned in delegation. So thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah. I think what happens is when you're fearful of delegating, then you make yourself the sole decision maker. And then everybody brings those decisions back to you because that's what you've trained them to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then your schedule gets so full that you can't breathe. And then you rob time from your family because you, instead of working a 40-hour a week or even less because you're the business owner and deserve a break, you're working a 70-hour a week. And then your family and your friends really suffer. And of course, you suffer from not having a wider life, wider meaning family, friends, community, religious organizations, all these things in your life to give you a well-balanced life.
Mm-hmm.
You're stuck on your business, so you've really limited your life. You've given yourself more anxiety. You're not building a support system around yourself. And of course, you're going to die early, right? Because you don't have those release valves that allow you to let go of some of the anxiety and the worry. And, you don't have the support of family and friends and the community in which you're part of.
And that goes back to the beginning of the conversation. How much joy do you have in your work life if you're working 70 hours because you don't want to give up things that are outside of strategy and culture that you mentioned a minute ago? If you're doing every little thing that needs to get done because you're fearful of letting go of it, that's not very joyful.
No, and it doesn't build a good quality life. That's for sure.
Right. You can make a lot of money, but how happy are you?
Yeah. So here's a coaching question.
Sure.
That I've asked a lot of people. How do you want to be remembered? So if you say, I'm going to write down the eulogy that someone's going to write about me after I'm gone, it's my funeral. Here's the eulogy that somebody will write about me. And it's going to be family member. They write a eulogy. Just imagine that you're going to have 4 or 5 eulogies at your funeral, right? A family member, a community member, an employee, and someone else from your business. So maybe a colleague or someone from another business, like a fellow CEO if you're a CEO, right?
Mm-hmm.
So write those 4 eulogies, how you want to be remembered, and then back up into your age right now. How do you have to act between, if your age is 40 and a projected death of 90, how do you have to act over the next 50 years in order for that eulogy to actually happen?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a very interesting exercise when people get into the nitty-gritty. And I want to be remembered as a favorite father. I want to be remembered as an empowering boss. I want to be remembered as a contributor to the community. I want to be remembered as somebody who mentored people. I want to be remembered as somebody who actually did great things. And, if you write those eulogies and then backtrack and put those things into your life so that that can come true, that's a great exercise for humbling yourself and saying what your true priorities are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I've had done this with many leaders, and it's amazing what they come up with, and it's amazing the changes they make because of what they're now faced with. They're not faced with the little details of how to do things every day, which are going to be hanging on control type things, but they're focused on, well, if I'm going to do this big thing, then I'm going to have to let some of the little things go and be handled by other people.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that it goes back to, do it by design or do it by default, which is what you were starting to really talk about.
Yeah.
And when it comes to culture in an organization, how do you get a CEO or a leader to understand the difference between default and design?
A lot of times it's how do you want to be remembered?
Okay.
And sometimes, and it's often about how do you want to grow? Do you want to stay the same? And a lot of times it's about how do you attract and retain staff? Because workers will leave a toxic culture and be attracted to a empowering culture. And so if you have a toxic culture, you're going to lose good talent. And if you have an attractive culture, people will flock to your culture because they're leaving their other toxic cultures behind. And so if you have an attractive culture, a culture of empowerment, a culture where people know there's going to be growth for them, a culture where they're appreciated and respected, then they're going to tell their friends, because A players like to work with other A players and they want to work in an A player environment. And so you foster the right culture and people will come knocking at your doors saying, do you have an opening for me? I really want to work here.
And that's a great place to be in today's environment.
That's right. That's right. And so people respond to different things. I listen. Part of being a coach is listening a lot, right? So I listen to what that person's value system is. If that person's value system is, I want to grow my business, I need good talent, then that's the reason for designing a great culture. If it's because I'm getting a little older and I'm thinking about my legacy, then that becomes their motivation for wanting to design a great culture, and that's what I present as maybe their primary. I ask them about, would that be your reason? So it really varies according to each coachee, uh, what their primary motivation is and what their value system is, and that's based a lot on their past and a lot on what they've gone through. So going back to that case study,
Right.
Sometimes it's not just about the culture. Sometimes it's, how am I leading in this culture? So for this particular executive director, he was working with a chairman of his board, and the chairman of the board was actually bullying him, was actually demanding things and saying things that were not particularly, I wouldn't say they were not nice, but they were couched in a lot of negativity and bullying. And so a lot of what I do as an executive coach is I'm a sounding board. So the director actually told me about this, and we rehearsed some things about how he could come back to that and open the discussion to that chairman, and also how he would handle his own anxiety. And it turns out that he had some past bullying in his childhood, and that was triggering all his negative emotions around that. And so how could he handle some of the negative emotions that came from his childhood now that he was an adult? Those kinds of things didn't have to trigger the same response. And so we talked about him handling his own emotions as well as him opening up the conversation with his chairman so that he could draw some lines and say, no, that's not acceptable. And it worked. It worked very well. He was able to handle some of his anxiety, and he was also able to convince the chairman not to bully him anymore.
And this is a big piece of what coaching is all about.
That's right.
I heard somebody say once that, well, they could figure it out on their own. And maybe you can figure out a lot of stuff on your own. You can read a lot of books, you can listen to podcasts, whatever. But when you've got to figure out something internally, like you just mentioned, it's very difficult to uncover those things that may have been that occurred in your childhood that now trigger you as an adult, as a leader, to a deficiency in what you do every day. So do you see that a lot, where you've got to really get somebody to focus in on those kinds of issues and why they happen?
Every human has blind spots and obstacles and things that they don't see, just because we all grow up with a certain perception, and it shapes how we see the world. And it's like we're looking through glasses, and sometimes those are brown colored, rose colored, green colored, yellow colored. I mean, you can use that metaphor. But our past always shapes how we see the present and the future. And sometimes you need someone to say, did you ever think about it this way? Which is a reframe, right? If you reframe it differently, it might not be something you can do on your own, because you have your own perception. But if someone else is being that sounding board, that person who says, how about thinking it differently? I mean, I worked with another client, and they were talking about making change and how difficult it was. And I went down the line of asking why and why and why and why, until he got to the point where I said, if I change, I'm basically admitting that everything I did in the past was wrong. And, that's really getting to a core fear, right? And I said, did you ever hear of the word evolution? You're evolving. It's okay to make changes and evolve and gradually change yourself based on who you are and what you've learned. And that was a reframe for him that would have never come if he relied on himself. And I'm glad that you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Because we can't see the world outside our own perception until someone gives us that aha that, oh, a reframe is possible.
Yeah.
Because it wouldn't have occurred to us on our own.
And I think the word blind spot is very accurate for everybody. I think we all have so many blind spots that we're just not aware of. And we behave in a certain way that's just the way I was taught. That's the way I was brought up. I've always done it this way. I mean, I've always done it this way doesn't necessarily make it correct or true, right? I'm sure you see that quite a bit.
Yeah, well, that's the favorite thing, right? That leaders have to deal with in their own companies with their staff. And then they have to deal with it in themselves, even if they think they're more enlightened. And what we're talking about is emotional intelligence, right? If somebody is emotionally intelligent, then they are very self-aware, and that allows them to interact with others from a position of, yeah, this is my perception, but they have their perception, and I know what created my perception, and I know I have a blind spot here and there. So let me focus on getting past that. And then the other part of emotional intelligence is awareness of others. What perceptions do they have? How forgiving should I be? Because they don't see it my way, because their background is having them frame the situation in their own way. And how can I be sensitive to that? One of the great examples I like to use is what's on the front of an ambulance. Well, it's the word ambulance spelled backwards. And that's because the people who really need to see it are the people who are in the car ahead, who are looking through the rear view mirrors. And when they look through the rear view mirror, the word ambulance is going to be spelled correctly. So they can, in a moment, make a snap judgment to pull over. Assuming it's safe to do that. The way that metaphor applies to conversation is a good leader is adaptable to having a conversation according to the way they think the listener is going to perceive it. So you might have an employee, if you're the leader, and you might have an employee who's very direct. Well, you're going to speak to that person in a very direct manner, because that's what's going to produce the best understanding and then result. You might talk to someone who is more chatty and wants to know something about, how you're feeling today, by having a little bit of chattiness before the meat of the conversation, just because it's going to make it easier for that person to listen and to hear you. And you as a leader are showing your adaptability to handle different staff in the ways that are going to make them the most productive.
Do you find with executives and leaders that you can, I don't know if train is the right word, but help improve their emotional intelligence?
Oh, definitely. That's a lot of what I do, is to point out things that they miss, and help them to see the empathy in the situation. And of course, they got to see it as a concept before they can feel it as a feeling. And some of them never make it to feeling as much as a real empathetic person who's naturally empathetic might. But if they've never been exposed to how an empathetic person would react, then that's a real blind spot for them.
And how do they react typically? I mean, I guess most people that are hiring you as a coach, they want your feedback. They want to be coachable. But do you ever encounter people who are very resistive to the idea of, well, you don't understand how my communication skills are. My communication skills are impeachable, or whatever they may say.
Well, I'll tell you, the two kinds of people who approach me to be a coach fall into two categories. There's the desperate and there's the inspired. So the inspired are those who want to be like an elite athlete. And an elite athlete always has a coach. In fact, a tennis person will have a coach for his forehand and a coach for his backhand. And in baseball, you'll have a coach for pitching and a coach for first base and a coach for catching. And in football, you've got your offense and defensive coaches, right? So they get very specific. But in the world of business, you usually have a coach that might be a leadership coach, but you might also have a sales coach, and you might also have, a operations coach. So the inspired people always want to get better. They always know there's self-improvement. They always know that I can be better than I've ever been. And they're looking for expansion in terms of emotional intelligence because they see how effective it is. And they want to be known as a great leader, and they want to enhance their careers. They don't want to be stuck. And so they're always inspired to do more in terms of self-improvement. Now, those who are desperate have usually reached the bottom and they're about to be fired. And the HR department is calling me saying, this is a last ditch effort with Joe. Can you really work with him? Try to bring him along. We want to give him one last shot. But if he's not going to adjust to working within the framework that we've established, we're going to have to let him go. And so Joe is kind of going along as a prisoner saying, all right, I guess I better do this. And what's the minimum I can do? Or occasionally you find somebody who says, listen, the company's given me this last shot. I'm going to do everything I can because I haven't really given myself any self-improvement for a while. And maybe this is a track I should be on. And so, and those are developmental coaching kind of opportunities. And then there's situational coaching where somebody says, listen, I got this one problem and I really want a coach to help me figure this out. So let's work together for 90 days till we get the situation taken care of. You know what happens? They get so much out of it, they continue for years and years. But there's people come from coaching for different reasons. And sometimes that HR department will say, we have internal coaches, but this particular person wants an external coach, meaning external outside the company, because they really don't want to share any confidences with people inside the company for fear, even though we have a confidentiality rule, for fear that something will slip and, they just feel more comfortable with an external coach. And I'm fine with that. And you find that with the higher executives, they want an external coach. They don't want anybody internal knowing what's going through their minds.
Yeah. What about the desperate? When you talked about the desperate, do they make good coaching clients? Do they make a turnaround, or is it desperate?
Some do, some don't. So I worked with one person who just had kind of one question about working with her staff. And then once she kind of got that question answered, then she felt she was fine. She didn't need any more. And so it was a multiple week program. So the ensuing weeks, she wasn't really engaged as much as she could have been. She wasn't really taking it to heart and challenging herself. Like, how does these new concepts and thoughts apply to me? She thought she was already well taken care of and well positioned with all the skills and talents that she needed. And other people are different, some people get a taste and say, oh, wow, this was so wonderful. I'm just going to continue because, if it got me from ground zero to ground one, just think of what it could do from ground, one to ground 2 and 3, right? And those people start out desperate, but then they get inspired.
That's great. Yeah. I'm sure that's a wonderful experience to witness.
Oh, it is.
Who are your favorite clients to work with?
Well, after I've worked with them, the favorite clients are the ones who tell me, I came across a situation rather than just react. I said to myself, what would Jerry say? So actually, and I don't care what comes out of my mouth because, they're going to really have what comes out of their mouth is what they've internalized, right? But the fact that they've stopped and they didn't just do an automatic response, but they did a well thought out response. It's not stimulus response, it's stimulus pause response. And in that pause, you get to say, am I reacting from a trigger from childhood? Am I reacting with something that's going to actually move the situation forward and be productive? Or am I going to just say, well, she's angry at me, I'm going to be angry right back? You know, that kind of situation. So that pause is really important. And a lot of coaching is to actually take advantage of that pause and to think what's going to move the situation forward, how it's going to show me as the best leader, what's going to create legacy for me, what's going to build a succession plan, what's going to empower that person to move forward, what kind of role model am I being so that I'm creating a design culture based on how I handle situations. And a lot of coaching is about that.
Yeah, I think that pause, which I would kind of term thoughtfulness, is lacking in a lot of communication today, because I think everybody wants to just react immediately without thoughtful response. And what comes out of somebody's mouth, whether it's in an email, a text message, or on the phone or on Zoom, is usually not very thoughtful.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big thing today. I think that thoughtfulness is a huge driver of success, and not just being liked, but whether if you're in sales, I think thoughtful salespeople come across better, and they're probably more successful than those that are just driven to close a sale. And the same thing with leaders, and just even people at the lower end of the organizational chart.
That's part of having the design culture. Is the design culture includes thoughtfulness, and it includes things that thoughtfulness that roll down from thoughtfulness. For instance, kindness and empowerment to somebody who's a direct report to you. Maybe they can think it through themselves if I ask them a question rather than just jump in and tell them the answer. And then they can figure it out for themselves a little later on. So what rolls down from executive coaching is team building things based on communication and collaboration. And my team do that. So I've worked with this coachee, the case study that I had, and then he asked me to work with his 8 direct reports so that they could communicate better with each other and have their departments collaborate more, which really breaks down siloing and allows better communication, not only at the top levels of each department, but at multiple levels throughout each department.
And when that level of collaboration, cooperation, communication exists within an organization, especially a larger organization, the more productive they're going to be. That's
right. And those productivity things have been measured. A lot of times it's 50% more productive. That's come through in some of the studies.
Wow, that's amazing.
And the other thing you should know is staff loyalty and customer loyalty rise in tandem or go down in tandem. And so if you have staff who stick around, the learning stays in the organization, the customer relationships get more solid. And so the customers are really the real recipients of a good culture.
It's interesting you should say that, because last week I had a call from an individual who had done some business with on the periphery. He wasn't directly my client, but he knew me. He was an advisor to my client. And he called me up and he says, "Do you have a minute?" Sure. So he says, "I want to talk to you about a couple of pieces of property that I need some assistance with for insurance." And the current broker relationship we have, I've been with them for years and years, but there's been just a shift, and I just don't feel like they get me. I don't feel like they care anymore. I just feel as though that I'm just getting pushed along. It's not a minor kind of an account, at least not in my world. And I thought it was interesting because it's a fairly well-known broker who probably has always done the right thing for this client, but it was the feeling. It wasn't any one particular issue. It was, my questions aren't being answered. They just don't care. It's just, and when those things start to percolate in any business, it spells trouble down the road, because like you said, if the employees are kind of wavering, and not feeling good about their jobs. If they're overworked, if they're not taking care of themselves, they're not going to take care of their customers, and then productivity is going to start to plummet as well as profitability. So
hmm
it was just it just hit me that it's kind of the same thing I experienced last week from a potential client.
Well, I'm glad you brought up that example because, the energy, the feeling that you said, um, that permeates all the relationships that all your staff have with all your clients. Because if that employee who's talking to that client doesn't feel cared for in the organization, they're going to become a quiet quitter. And a quiet quitter is one of those words that's, the word of the day, right? It used to
Yeah.
be the Great Resignation. Now it's called quiet quitting. But it's people who stay and they do their job from 9 to 5. They take their paycheck, but they could care less about being there. They could care less about being an advocate for the company. They could care less about caring about clients. They're just putting in time. And in some ways, they've quit their job. They're going through the motions, but they've quit. And that will really destroy customer relationships, and it will absolutely destroy a culture that you're trying to grow by design. And it will actually, with staff relationships, no one will be attracted to work there, and a number of your good people will leave because they want to work somewhere where they feel cared about.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how can you have a culture where people feel cared about? Um, You include things like some health and wellness programs. You include things by of regular thank yous and appreciation from you personally. You make sure there's professional development so everybody feels there's a growth path for them, that they have reason to stay. You empower them to take on more decision making. You train your managers how to be coaching managers and not just authoritarian managers. Because people don't quit their companies, they quit their managers, right? And so you want your managers are key people to do things right and to foster this design culture of caring. And so you want them to um, well, I coach managers to have an 8-step process of having a coaching conversation, or, an employee comes to you. You first identify that you create some commonality with that employee, and then you take them through the process of helping them define the goal, define options for solving that goal, and for accomplishing and executing it. And then you help them process it at the end. What have they learned that they could apply in the future? So you're helping them build some critical decision-making skills, some creativity skills, and you're making that employee a better employee. That employee then becomes eligible to be more a part of your succession plan. But also, that employee feels valued. That employee feels like, oh, my manager has confidence in me. I can have confidence in myself. That manager really cares that I learn. That manager really cares that I can handle something on my own. Um, and, especially if you tie it into the vision of the company, then that employee feels I'm part of and I belong here and I'm part of what we're doing going forward. And that brings it back to joy, meaning, and empowerment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Meaning is so important. People need to know they're part of the vision. They need to know that they're just not a cog in the wheel, but they can make a contribution to the success of the company, to
Mm-hmm.
the success of the department, to the success with clients, that they really have um, a meaningful place in everything that's we're growing toward.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
And that's part of the culture.
Yep. 100%. Jerry, we could go on. I could go
Right.
on forever
Yeah, we
about
could
this kind of stuff.
teach courses about this, right?
Yeah, I love these conversations. I love talking about productivity, culture, joyfulness, thoughtfulness, all of it. It's really good stuff. Um, but being respectful of your time and everybody else's, I want to kind of wrap it up there, unless there's a couple of points that we missed. I don't know. Did we hit everything you wanted to talk about today?
Well, the other thing that I just want to mention
Sure.
is there's a very famous quote. culture eats strategy for breakfast. So if you're a business leader and you're going to focus on culture and strategy, and you think, well, I'm a strategic person, I'm going to focus on strategy, 90%, and culture 10%. Wrong. Reframe. You're better off focusing on culture 60% and strategy 40%, because culture is going to eat that strategy, and nobody's going to implement your strategy unless you've got a good culture.
Well taken. Good quote. If people wanted to get in touch with you, how's the best way to do that?
Certainly, I'm open to LinkedIn messages, so you can find me under Jerry Quinn on LinkedIn. I'm also available by email, Jerry, Jeri, at driving improved with an ED, improved results with an S.com. Jerry at drivingimprovedresults.com. And I have a website, Driving Improved Results. You can check that out as well.
Great. I'll include all of those contact points in our show notes so that if anybody wanted to reach you, they could. And I appreciate you being on the show with me today. I'll see you when I get back into the city a little bit more frequently, hopefully.
Yep.
And if anybody else has an interesting story like Jerry's and they'd like to share it on this podcast, get in touch with me. I'd love to talk to you. My contact info will be in the show notes as well. And until next time, be well. Jerry, thanks again for being on the show.
Gordon, it's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed this conversation so much. Thank you.
Thanks.
That's it for this week's episode of the New York Business Leaders Podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode. In the meantime, find more interviews and resources at nybusinessleaders.com.